40 people are killed in the latest U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. Did President Biden violate the Nixon Act, the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973? We'll get to those in a minute. Iraq, Syria, along with Russia, Iran condemns U.S. strikes. This is from Voice of America. U.S. military retaliatory strikes on pro-Iranian militia forces inside both Syria and Iraq early Saturday have prompted condemnation for both the Syrian and Iraqi governments, as well as several countries that are allied, both Damascus and Baghdad. Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal al-Mikdad said in a statement the U.S. attacks will seriously increase tensions in the region. Just to add as well, this will actually give fuel to the Islamic militants, the Wahhabi-backed groups from Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Qatar to keep attacking alongside with the U.S. military. Now, the U.S. military is not fighting alongside the militants, but we had a history of backing these militants, especially in Syria. Faisal al-Mikdad said that this will seriously increase tension in the region, as Syrian state TV quoted the Syrian Defense Ministry, which claimed the United States attacked Syrian government forces, which are fighting the Islamic State terrorist group, alleging the United States is trying to help the terrorists regroup. Well, they're not. One thing you have to understand is that not fighting alongside the militants. It's just that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, in this case, they might aid, and they have done it in the past with Operation Timber Sycamore, funding or giving military aid to these militant groups in the hopes of ousting the Assad government. Now, at the same time, after the civil war of Iraq in 2006, with Noor al-Maliki, in which he precipitated, the United States basically created that vacuum with the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I say illegal because it was not based on any evidence whatsoever that Iraq was procuring chemical or biological weapons with al-Qaeda, blamed with the 9/11 attacks. That's an illegal war. So you see that there's a fine line between supporting the militants or indirectly supporting the militants, mind you. So be careful with words. Rami Abdulrahman with the Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights told Arab media that the U.S. attacks targeted pro-Iranian militia and Syrian government forces, along with the border with Iraq in the area between al-Bukmal and Deir el-Zor, in addition to the Iraqi border post of Al-Qaim. He said that the Iranian al-Quds forces, as well as Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces and pro-Iranian militia forces, were hitting U.S. strikes on the Syrian border region between al-Bukmal, al-Mayadin, and Deir el-Zor. Deir el-Zor, much like al-Bukmal, were under al-Qaeda affiliates and Islamic State control at one point. And it's coincidentally, it just seems that this is actually refueling the Wahhabi militant group's mindset, saying that we'll use the West to facilitate and defeat the secular Arab governments. Because what they want ultimately is a caliphate. Just like the settlers in Israel. Well, they don't want a global caliphate. What they want is from the river to the sea. That's only because there's not enough Jews in the world to take over the world. Understand? So the Wahhabi militant mindset is basically this. They want a caliphate all around the world because there are more Muslims. So the Jews, the Zionists anyway, and the Israeli settlers, what do they want? They just want to expand the borders of Israel just a little bit, north and south, and east, to basically have Egypt and Jordan basically control or take in the Palestinian refugees, because they want Israel to be in a Jewish-only state, in light of the violations of the international community, as well as the Rome Statutes of The Hague. Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani declared an official period of mourning for the victims of the U.S. attacks on the pro-Iranian Hashad al-Shaliba militia headquarters in the El-Qaim in the town of Al-Kashat. At least 18 people were killed, according to an Iraqi government spokesman. The Hashad also claimed to have struck the Al-Hadir U.S. base in the Kurdistan capital of Erbil. That was not confirmed. Iraqi state TV reported that government spokesman Bassem al-Awadi denied U.S. reports that had consulted with the Iraqi government before the U.S. strike, claiming that the United States was trying to mislead world opinion. I believe that. I'm going to tell you why. Adding that the U.S. attacks put Iraq on the brink of a precipice. The Iraqi parliament convened an urgent session to discuss the repercussions of the U.S. strikes and the presence of foreign forces on Iraqi soil. If Iraq keeps this up, there'll be a third invasion. Even though this is an invasion. An invasion of superiority, airspace. The Iraqi foreign minister said it would summon U.S. Charge of Affairs David Baker to express his condemnation. Iran, which supports the military reports, are talking about a U.S. attacks, called attacks a violation of Syrian and Iraqi sovereignty and their territorial integrity. Iranian foreign minister spokesman Nasir Kanani termed the U.S. attacks a serious strategic mistake. And I don't think it's a mistake. It was on purpose. And I think the pressure came from Israel. And, it's not pick on Israel day, but come on, man. And, for 25 years, no, let's just say it, 30 years, since the first Gulf War in 1990, we have not stopped our military incursion into Iraq, which extended to Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Sudan, Yemen, but conveniently leaves out the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and that Israel has a tentative relationship with these countries. You can see the broader picture, which is, really noticeable at this point. The broader picture is three countries: United States, Syria, United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And with the United States comes the coalition partners like Australia, Canada, Germany, France. London-based Iran analyst Ali Nourzadeh tells the Voice of America that Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was extremely concerned about a possible U.S. strike against Iranian territory and dispatches Al-Quds Forces commander Ismail Qayyem to Baghdad several days ago to warn them not to kill Americans, to provoke them to retaliate. What they're trying to do is disillude from World War III here. It's funny that the Muslims, in this sense, are trying to prevent World War III while the secular West and the Zionist state of Israel trying to provoke it. Meanwhile, you have these, Zionist evangelical Christians that support DeSantis and Trump, who basically want the end of the world. Because they take Revelation seriously, Book of Revelations. Khamenei's advice was you shouldn't go to kill Americans, Nourzadeh said. So you can't blame Iran for trying to kill Americans, because here they are trying to say to Iranian-backed militias and their supporters, wherever they are, not to kill Americans. Meanwhile, we have the evangelicals screaming in the pulpits to destroy Iran, make it a parking lot. Israel, same thing. Israel is even worse, because you got these people who are basically going right in front of the TV, and the only criticisms are coming from Israeli liberal newspapers like Haaretz or the Jerusalem Post. Meanwhile, I'm in New York City, and it's a liberal Jewish state, but I mean, you have these crazy Zionists out in the streets supporting this. There's a poll recently that in Israel, that 60% of the people that were polled, and I don't know the exact number, but these polls I don't really like, but whoever polled these people, every 6 out of 10 that were polled believed that the Israeli government is not doing enough when it comes to the Gaza situation. Militarily, not doing enough. Meanwhile, they're turning it into a complete wasteland. U.S. Senator Jack Reed, who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee, had harsh words for Iran, of course, because he is a coward. However, saying that Iran's proxy forces in Syria and Iraq have been dealt a significant blow, and Iranian-linked militias around the Middle East should understand that they too will be held accountable. Here's a sellout, Jack Reed, right? Because here he is actually criticizing the Shia militias who are fighting against the Wahhabi-backed groups in Iraq and Syria. What is it? The war on terrorism or the war against the people who are fighting against terrorism? I don't know. Which one is it? Now, here's another issue, too. Some people have brought this up, like the people at the Libertarian Institute. And we're going to go to them in a minute, too, because they've been doing fantastic reporting. In fact, let me go to the history, and which I'm going to use kind of Freeman and Colangelo in a minute. But let's go to the issue of the War Powers Resolution Act of 1973 for a minute, because I feel this is warranted here. Now, when it comes to using the military to strike a foreign government, they need to have the unilateral support of Congress. Now, I'm going to read you the War Powers Resolution Act so that you can understand what's going on here. The War Powers Resolution 1973, known as the War Powers Act, is a congressional resolution designed to limit the U.S. president's ability to initiate or escalate military actions abroad, because we've had presidents before, like Roosevelt and Wilson, who basically used the military to just go and engage war wherever you find it. Let's firebomb Indonesia, for example. It's part of our system of governmental checks and balances. The law aims to check the executive branch's power while committing U.S. military forces to an armed conflict without the consent of the U.S. Congress. Right. So you don't want the president to have too much power, because he could just basically be a fucking madman, which is what Obama and Bush and Trump and Biden are. They're all sickos. And it's amazing. Millions of people vote for these people. They don't. I think the people are sick. The American people are sick to actually vote for murderers and rapists. And it's very contradictory, right? We have a justice system in this country. Broken as it is, it's, sometimes it still works. And we incarcerate murderers, rapists, people who do physical and maim physically, victims. Yet you have the president who makes these decisions without any congressional authority whatsoever, or violate these acts and memorandums in the appeasement of foreign governments and the intelligence services. That's why we have this memorandum called the Nixon Act. It stipulates that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of military action, and prohibits armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days, right? So where did Biden get the authority from Congress to strike not just one country, but two? Syria and Iraq. Where did that authority come from? Did it come from the Department of Defense? Did it come from him? Did it come from the Israeli government? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Or the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee pressure on Congress? I mean, I don't know the answer. And we shouldn't make up one. We should be dutiful of reporters of just the facts. If you're going to speculate, at least be responsible to say enough. But, opinionated answers are not going to basically solve the problem. If we're going to take this head on, we need to show the evidence. The Constitution divides war powers between Congress and the president, and only Congress can declare war and appropriate military funding, yet the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Yes, he is the commander-in-chief, but he needs congressional approval to go to war. Now, the United States is basically saying, well, we're in Iraq. We're fighting against the militants. Well, is that really the case? Because CNN reported in 2020, this comes from Tamara Olbaugh and Joanna Kaddish and Awa Daman, and you can see January 6, 2020. What does it say here? Iraq has voted to expel U.S. troops. Whether they'll actually be kicked out is far from clear. Now, technically, they were voted out, according to this article. Here, I'll read it. When Iraqi's parliament voted to expel American troops from the country Sunday, so there was an actual vote, to expel the American troops from the country, yet they stayed. It was an apparent bid by the government to extract the country from an escalating U.S.-Iran proxy war. Look at this. 4 years prior to the strikes, there it is. Even the Iraqi government knew what was going to happen. They knew that the U.S. presence in Iraq was basically to goad Iran into an all-out conflict. This is 4 years prior to what was happening today. Would that make the Iraqi government prophets? No, because the writing was on the fucking wall, right? It's obvious. It was obvious to anyone what was going on here. Fears of Iraq once again turning into a battleground of widespread tensions in the Middle East have risen dramatically in the aftermath of the U.S. targeted killing of Iran's most powerful military general, Qasem Soleimani, who basically was fighting against the Islamic State and al-Qaeda affiliates and eliminating them. He was known to use the Al-Quds Force, in which he was the commander of, to destroy these people. Well, you can't do that with these U.S.-backed mercenaries. Hey, we need to get rid of these people. They're dangerous. What? They're fighting the war on terrorism. Remember, the United States was at the war with terrorism? What happened? Now we're fighting against the people who are actually fighting against terrorism. And where's this pressure coming from? Well, it's coming, obviously. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and the Department of Defense. And the State Department. And the combination of all this. Well, who the terrorists are. Who is the real terrorists? A perpetual state of conflict. We're fighting against the terrorists and also fighting against the people who are eliminating our terrorists while we support them backdoor with covert black operations like Temple Sycamore. Baghdad acted quickly. Caretaker Prime Minister Ali Abdul Mahdi held an emergency session in Parliament to vote on whether the government should continue allowing U.S. military and other U.S. foreign troops to remain in the country. The resolution was passed overwhelmingly by Shia lawmakers. Most members of Iraq's other factions set out to vote, dealing potentially yet another blow to President Trump's Middle East strategy. In fact, it wasn't Trump's Middle East strategy. It's a strategy by the Department of Defense, the Israeli government, and Saudi Kingdom. Because all three of these countries' governments have a different vested interest in the Middle East. Okay? With the U.S., they're expanding their empire. With Israel, it's basically getting rid of all the Arab countries. And with Saudi Arabia, it's a religious war, Sunni versus Shia. It's not a conspiracy. It's what's happening. And if you look at the history of all three of these countries and their interests abroad and what their religious profiles are, you'll understand that this is the obvious answer. Iraq's priorities in the U.S. are increasingly at odds, Abdul Mahdi said during the address to Parliament. He said a U.S. troop withdrawal was the only way to protect all those on Iraqi soil, especially American forces that require protection from the Iraqis. It would be difficult for Iraqi security forces to protect U.S. forces after recent events, given that unilateralism has won over political decision-making, the prime minister said. In response, Trump has threatened to sanction Baghdad. You ain't kicking us. Imagine a foreign country saying, we're staying or we're putting sanctions on your country. Right? Imagine Russia saying that to the United States. You can't invade Syria and Iraq. We're going to put sanctions on your country. Oh, World War III. World War III. And then you get, pieces of shit like Donald Trump and Joe Biden who violate everyone's sovereignty. As well, that comes with invading airspace with foreign military airstrikes, right? They don't care about sovereignty of other countries. They don't have respect for anybody. It'll make Iranian sanctions look somewhat tame, he added, a reference to over 1,000 rounds of economic penalties imposed by the U.S. on Tehran after the Trump administration pulled out of the multi-Iran nuclear deal in 2018. Now, one of the more prominent voices, the most respected voices regarding Syria and Iraq, and as well as Yemen and Ukraine and Israel and the Palestinians, have been the Libertarian Institute. And there was a video put out a week ago talking about when the U.S. troops were killed in Jordan, is war with Iran next? And it's something that kind of this is Kyle Anzalone, who's, a legend in my mind. Guy puts out videos every single day, updating videos. He's a prominent voice in foreign policy, and so is Connor Freeman. who I respect the hell out of. I think these two guys are the forces that people should be listening to. And here's what Freeman had to say, and I'll just back myself out of here.
There's a real risk here that he follows down that path. Now, I guess the one thing that I'm hopeful for is, it does seem that we're at the point where whatever happens next, it's going to be a major escalation. And so let's hope that both sides see that, and maybe, we have a response that it looks more like the aftermath of the Soleimani assassination, where, the U.S. service members, over 100, received, traumatic brain injuries, concussions, and that attack. That's a very serious response, that Iranian missile attack on the U.S. bases in Iraq. But at the same time, it wasn't meant to escalate the situation. It wasn't meant to kill American soldiers. And so there is a way to navigate this where it doesn't have to escalate to the point where, uh, this is a full-on regional war, but it's hard to imagine Joe Biden, who's been driving down the same road since he entered politics about 5 decades ago now, Connor, that he's suddenly going to change lanes here. He's always been an absolute lunatic when it came to Israel policy. Now, I guess one thing worth mentioning, Connor, is the American empire isn't what it once was. And, maybe there are people within the US who are trying to, speak to the reality of the situation on the ground. I'm not particularly hopeful, but one of the things I had planned to talk about on today's show was that the US had pressed China to pressure Iran to reduce military tensions in the Middle East. Now, in a way, this seems irrelevant. Whatever the US and China had discussed about what tensions needed to be reduced. But if the U.S. did get an agreement from China to go and say to the Iranians, like, hey, it's better at a 6 than a 7 or something like that, like just dial it back a little bit, that this could be something that works out in the favor for those of us who don't want to see a major escalation here. If the Iranians are the Chinese, are kind of interested right now, just going to the Iranians and saying, like, hey, we don't want a major escalation here. That's not good for our global commerce and economic commerce. And I'm sure, Russia probably sees it the same way as well. Like, another major regional war isn't going to help what they're trying to do in Ukraine. So, there may be some geopolitical factors pushing against war. Although, I guess it's also possible that Beijing and Moscow see this as an opportunity, right? Like, the more you can weaken the U.S. empire. Although I'm not quite sure if they're quite as callous as Washington willing to do to Iran what the U.S. has done to Ukraine. All right, next up here is an article that I wrote for.
So, and just before this is what Connor Freeman had to say regarding what they foresaw, what was going to happen regarding the attacks uh, on the three American servicemen that killed, those three people in Jordan. And Freeman was asked about his point from Kyle Angelou.
Nuclear program throughout 2021, uh, completely trying to sabotage any sort of negotiations to have some level of peace and diffusing of tensions between the U.S. and Iran. And so they've made sure that both sides of the aisle are just vehemently against any return to the JCPOA and any kind of just normal relations with a country of 80 million people. I mean, if you want to have peace in the Middle East, the U.S. is going to have to get along with Persia, despite whatever Israel may want. And at the same time, we're just, the whole world is, including most of the, as you pointed out recently, most young people and Democrats see this White House as being complicit in genocide. And you have this problem where whenever we underwrite all of Israel's aggressions in the region, we're going to get attacked for that because we're the world empire and they're our client state, and there's no ambiguity about that for anybody who lives in that part of the world. And so in the meantime, the whole media is now going to say that Iran did this to us. They killed our boys, and now Biden has to do something. And what I fear is the Biden administration is so their foreign policy, just like everything else, is all about domestic politics, and that's mostly what the Israel stuff comes down to, because none of this serves our any strategic interest or any American interest. It's not for our own good. Maybe it is for our own politicians and the military-industrial complex, but so he's going to probably, who knows? I mean, whatever happens next is going to be a very significant, potentially catastrophic escalation. I don't have no idea what it's going to look like. We're going to find out soon. But as you can imagine, I think we're all thinking the same thing, that just this is the worst possible administration to put the American people in this position. And I hope that we just do not fall for the usual scam and go, well, Americans died, so now we have to go to war, instead of blaming the politicians who put our, sons and daughters in harm's way and got them killed for no good reason. They're the ones who should be held accountable, not, we should not be going to war with Iran or any other country in the Middle East. But that's what's going to be offered up as the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
right. Look, and Freeman is right. I mean, he hit it dead on the pocket right here, right? So what do we do next? I mean, what's the reasonable action next? Well, look, if the United States, if the State Department basically sees Iran as the threat, it does it see the country as a threat? No, it sees the mullah as the threat, technically, right? So you want to get rid of Ali Khamenei, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Well, you need to appease to the very people who are actually protesting against these mullah and these ghoulish mullahs, right? And I support them. Is that the people need to be supported by the U.S. government. No, what the U.S. government did was basically commit sanctions on Iran, basically starving and hurting the very people who they need on their side to eliminate the threat. But if you eliminate the threat, then you don't have a threat anymore, right? So in other words, what the United States is doing is basically using the pretext of getting rid of the mullahs by committing to sanctions and getting out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, that Freeman was talking about in 2018 under the Trump administration, was so that Iran cannot defend itself. Now, we did this in Iraq in the first Gulf War, and we did it in 2003. But in the first Gulf War, we have made sanctions with the Oil for Food program, which killed over 500,000 men, women, and children. Basically, the working poor. Who it didn't hurt? The Ba'athist ghouls of Saddam Hussein's ministry. That's who. And then what happened? Well, we destroyed the country from within. They couldn't defend themselves, and we actually killed more civilians. In which that made that Jane Pauley, 60 Minutes, who basically interviewed Clinton's Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, in which she said the famous words, "Yeah, I think the price was worth it." It is what the people actually think of, poor people. They don't give a shit, right? So now we fast forward 2003. What happened? We commit new round sanctions on Iraq for their position of procuring chemical and biological weapons with Al Qaeda, which was based on a lie. And we went to war and we destroyed the country from within, killing, hundreds, a million people, over a million people this time, worse than the first Gulf War. And we don't know whether the numbers are. We don't know that the actual numbers could be anywhere between 1 million to 1.5 million, because we'll never know actually. But still, was the price worth it? No, because the country went to 2 civil wars, which basically gave us the Islamic State Levant, who we basically went to war with. But meanwhile, we're backing the Salafi militant groups to oust the Syrian government. And basically, they didn't stop there. They went all over the place. They took the weapons and the aid and all the financing that the U.S. government and the Saudis and the Turkish and the Israeli government basically offered to them, and went all around the world, committing their atrocities. So now here we have Iran, basically. So this is the tools needed to destroy a country is to commit sanctions upon them, make them so weak to the point that you have internal turmoil, the people against the government, because the people are blaming the government. Look, the U.S. is committing sanctions on us. Meanwhile, the people aren't blaming the U.S. for this. Why aren't you supporting us? Because they don't care about the Iranian people. That's why. Nobody does. Nobody except for the people protesting the street and people like myself and others who are trying to warn the public about what is going on in their name. And if you're going to follow the works of people who talk about dating relationships online and trans binary people and gossip like Tim Pool or other Alex Jones and other big platforms that don't talk about the real issues. Seriously. And you have the left platforms, so basically, just railing against the right, and all this is basically creating a confusion among the people, but they're not reporting on the real issues, which we need to start paying attention to because we're this close to World War III. I haven't seen uh, um, us at the doomsday clock so close as to the Cold War period, which I was around for as well. Okay, this is all for the update for tonight. And if there's any more updates, which I'm sure there's going to be, I will let you know without bias, without prejudice. Guys, have a good night. Have a good weekend.